Let's talk about faith. And specifically, I want to talk about blind faith. Now, some of the things I'm about to say, some of you may say, hey, that sounds a little bit like some of the things that William James said in his famous essay, The Will to Believe. You are correct. James stands in the background of some of what I'm going to say here, because as the saying goes, there is nothing new under the sun. Cite your sources. So these are, however, my thoughts on specifically the concept of blind faith. So first of all, let's talk about the concept of faith. What is faith? Well, the minimal definition of faith is trust. And it's kind of easy to see that if you just consider how the word faith is used in popular parlance. If a person says, have a little faith in me, what they're saying is, have a little bit of trust in me. Do you have faith in this person? Do you trust this person? Do you have faith that that bridge will stay up when you drive over it? Do you trust that that bridge will stay up when you drive over it? Just by playing that simple substitution game, you can quickly identify that sort of this most common standard use of the word faith is trust. Now, there are rational grounds to trust and thus to exercise faith, and there are irrational grounds to trust or exercise faith. And when it comes to the latter, people often think the concept of blind faith or the idea of blind faith is one that is intrinsically irrational, because in blind faith, you don't have any objective rational grounds to trust. So you don't have any objective rational grounds to exercise faith, and thus to exercise faith, it is assumed must be irrational. I want to dispute that. I want to argue or point out that there are instances where the exercise of blind faith or trust in the absence of any veridical evidence to support that trust is nonetheless rational. And that is if the condition is met that it is a particular forced action. Now, I'm going to say more about that in a moment, but first of all, I want to give you an illustration of faith, and I think faith well exercised. So imagine that you are mountain climbing and you're climbing with an expert mountain climber who is your guide to the mountain and who knows that mountain intimately. And at one point, you're descending the mountain. Let's say this, that you are caught in a storm and the snow is blowing and it's almost zero visibility and it's freezing cold. And if you don't get down off the mountain or find shelter soon, you will freeze to death and die, surely. And you're climbing down the mountain, and then suddenly you're tethered, but suddenly you slip, and then you go over the edge of a cliff, and you're swinging on your tether in midair in the high winds, and it's just a swirl of whiteout of snow. And then you hear the call of the mountain guide, the master mountaineer who's with you, and he says, "Cut the tether." Now, if you cut the tether, what you're doing is you're exercising faith in your mountain guide. And because he is an expert mountain guide, you could say that that's a rational faith under those circumstances. There's no better option available to you. And so you cut the tether, and lo and behold, you fall 10 feet into a snowbank from which you can quickly climb to the safety of the cleft of a rock, and you can ride out the storm. So it all ends well because you had faith. But let's change up that scenario a little bit and then introduce the concept of the idea of blind faith. So let's say that you are not with a mountaineer, you're alone and you're descending the mountain in the midst of that storm, and you go over the cliff and you're swinging at the end of your tether in the swirl of snow. Now, in fact, this scenario is one that you find very memorably described in the documentary Touching the Void, I believe it was called, about two fellows caught in a storm on a mountain. So let's say you're in that scenario and you're swinging on the end of your tether in the blowing snow, and you are simply unable to climb up the tether and back to the cliff to make your way back up further. So your only options at that point are to continue to swing in the midst of the storm or to cut the tether and fall into the void. Now, if you were to cut your tether to fall into the void, you would arguably be acting in faith. Again, you'd be trusting that you would end up not dead, right? In a better situation than you were when you're swinging in the void. But because there's no really rational evidential grounds to trust the conclusion that this will in fact save your life, it would in fact be what we can call blind faith. Now, here's the thing to appreciate is that blind faith exercised in this manner is not irrational. Rather, it would be a rational response to the situation. And it would be so because it is a forced action. Your only options at this point are to continue swinging in the storm and slowly freezing to death, or cutting the tether and hoping for the best. And under those circumstances, the exercise of blind faith can be a rational one. Now, one thing to appreciate here is how we might think about the nature of blind faith. Under these circumstances, I would submit that a good way to think about it is the exercise of hope. In other words, when you have a forced situation, your only choices are A or B. Continue to swing on the end of the tether and slowly freeze to death and die, or cut the tether and fall hopefully to safety. Then that would be a forced action where you're choosing the latter and you are hoping that you survive. You may not be rationally justified in believing you will survive, but you are rationally justified in acting with the hope that you will survive. And that is blind faith, and I believe it can be rational. And so then the questions are, when it comes to big existential questions, are we ever in a situation similar to being on that mountain swinging in the void, where we have a forced action and the only choices are A or B, and you may not have positive evidence to support B, but given that A is not a good option, you can nonetheless be rationally justified in acting so as to achieve B, and thus hope you achieve B. If there are such circumstances in the grand metaphysical or theological sweep of things, then you could say that those are rational exercises of blind faith.